Hello everyone, my name is Rui Jafari and I would like to welcome you to another video. In this video, we are going to focus on the data type DateTime. In the previous video, we saw how being able to specify the data type of our data correctly could mean a lot of improvement for our codes and for our solutions. In this video, we're going to focus specifically on one data type that is kind of unique in many aspects and look at it in two examples on how this one data type can make our code work more seamlessly and actually make more sense. Okay, so let's look at the two examples together. Okay, so in this video, we're going to use these three modules. So let me go ahead and import them. And in the first example, the task that we want to accomplish is that we want to integrate two data sources about the same data objects, right? So we've got electricity data and the temperature data. So one of the data has 2016 and 2017. We only want to use the temperature data and the electricity consumption data of 2016. We want to combine these two data sets, right? So let's take a look at these data. Let's go ahead and read them and look at them just, for the first time. We can see that, we've got date, time, and consumption. And here we've got timestamp and temperature. And this is the temperature, right? So we can see that the date and time for the electricity consumption data is the interval is every 15 minutes. Here is every hour, right? So here we want to actually combine them on a larger scale. We want to combine them on every day, right? So we have to do some aggregation for being able to do that. Before we move on, let me make sure that I am mentioning that I'm going to be making these data available in the GitHub repository that's going to be in this video's link for you to be able to get access to the data and also be able to get access to the raw format of the code. Okay, so I'm going to do all of that. The link's going to be available in the description in the video. Okay, all right. So these are the two data sets we want to combine. Like I said, we want to combine them at everyday level, right? So we want to do some aggregation for both of them before we do the aggregation integration. All right, so let's take a look at what we have here. You can see that our date and time, the data type object, right? So these are the timestamp event. So it's a timestamp, it's a data type of object. Actually, what's happening here is that Pandas is recognizing these as string, right? So these are just type strings that is being read here. So we are going to solve this in two approaches. The first approach, we're going to do this as if the date and time are actually strings, right? We could not use date time as we don't have to use it, but the point I'm trying to make here is that if we were to use date time, our code would be much simpler and more makes more sense, right? So first thing we need to do our aggregation to make sure that we've got the day electricity consumption data, right? So this is daily electricity consumption data, so we've got that. And also we want to do the same thing for temperature. However, before we do that, we need to make sure that we have the date and time separated. If you remember, the date and time was in the same column, right? So we have to use the function split over this t to separate these, right? So we separate them here, right? And once we do that, we do have our date and time. So now we can go ahead and do the group by and the mean and get the date temp SR, which is a series, right? So now we can see that our indexes of our both data that we want to combine are both date, right? And normally that's what we need before we join two data sets, before we join two data frames, right? However, since these are strings, they have different types of formats, right? You see, like, this is the month comes first, and then the day comes, and then the year comes in this data. And this one, this is year, month, day. And here it's using dashes, here it's using slashes, here it's using 0, 1, 0, 2 versus 1, 2, 3, right? So we need to do some changes if we are using string as our data types here, right? So here for let's start with the day electric DF, right? So we reset the index, so now we've got the date to be able to work with this and change this up, right? And what we do here, we try to change up the format of this date so it matches with the temperature, right? So this is doing that, splitting over the slashes, and then use a function format to create the same format, right? So we have to do all of this to be able to manage what we need to do, right? So this takes care of that, and then once we have that, right? So let me actually go ahead and see what we got here. So now we've got the new formatted data here, right? So pay attention to that. I mean, it was formatted differently, right? So now we can go ahead and set our index as this new data, right? So let me go ahead and show you guys what happened. So we've got this index, and also pay attention, our temp also had very similar index, right? So actually the same indexes, right? So now after jumping through these hoops, now we can go ahead and use the function join to integrate these data, right? So our integrate df will look like this, right? So they have been integrated seamlessly because we were able to make sure that the format and the values are sort of like be able to like connect to each other, right? And now we can, for instance, when we do any data integration, we want to do that so we get some analytics value. The analytics value we get here is that we get to see that in the location that this data was collected from, as the temperature goes higher, the amount of electricity that we use, probably a colder area, right? So that was when we didn't want to use, or we didn't know about how we should use the data type DateTime, right? So now let's do the same thing, but this time we want to use the function DateTime, right? So on this one, we want to be able to use the pandas function to DateTime. For us to be able to do that, we have to first make sure that we've got our data, this is our original data, actually date and time, right? So we add them together, and then we use the function pd.toDateTime, which is a very powerful function. It's very smart. For the most part, you can detect your format as well. We can just, create our DateTime, and once it's done, which took 3 seconds to do it, because like I said, it has to figure out the format. It just gives us the DateTime, right? So now it's a DateTime, and we can go ahead and actually check this, right? So we can go ahead and say electric df dot info, and it's the type DateTime, right? So the good things about the type DateTime is that you can access to the date, to the weekday, to the the day of the week, if it's weekend or not, right? So you can access all of those things by just calling it, right? So you don't have to do a lot of manipulation. It's like a data object specifically designed for working with date, right? But here, what we want is to separate the date, right? We don't have to do any splitting. You just have to say, okay, I want the date. And to access all of those with pandas, you have to go through the DT. So it's like your column that is date time, then dt, and then dot date. And then, the date, dot day, dot month, dot weekday, dot year, all of that just can be accessible by going through this dt, right, in pandas. So we can get our date. Once we do that, we see that now our date is a date. So now we do the same thing for the temptf date time, right? For the timestamp, and then we get a date time, and now we update our date, and now our temptf also is of the type date, right? So these are all type date, and now we can just join them and do the plots, and we do see the same plots, right? Exact same plot. But for us to be able to get there, it was easier, and we just were able to use the functionalities that pandas give us for the date time. So it was an easier transition to be able to create these two data types to make sure that they are sort of like joinable, right? So that was the first example. Now let's look at the second example. In this example, we want to basically visualize our orders in the last couple of years, right? So this is the data that it's from 2021 to 2022, right? So the number of orders for an item. This is the data that I have simulated, right? So not the real data. So we look at our data, we can again see that date is object and quantity is float. Now, we can sort of like go ahead and visualize this, but there are some problems with this visualization. The problem is that, first of all, look at these axes, like, x-axis. These are mushed up together, right? We have to do some processing to be able to like make sure that this looks good. Secondly, this data is biased. The reason, look at these dates, right? So there are some jumps between these dates, even though they're ordered. There's some jumps between these dates that the quantity have been 0, right? So the quantity started decreasing, right? And at some point, there were some days that we had 0 orders, right? Those are these days, but we don't see them here. When we do the smoothing of this smoothing is not correct because there are some days that are 0 and we don't have them in the data just because they're 0. So one thing we could do is to create a code that makes sure that it looks up the calendar to make sure that that date is there, and then by doing that, make sure that if there is a date in the calendar and we don't have that here, then put a 0 there. So that's one way to go about this. That's the hard way. The easy way is to take advantage of the DateTime data type, right? So let's go ahead and see how that can look like, right? So we switch our order, right? We switch the type of our date to DateTime, right? So once we look at it, this is now DateTime. Now we want to be able to have all the dates in our data from the beginning to the end, right? So we look at the delta, number of days, right? So this is the delta, the max and the mean, right? So it tells us there are 364 days between them, right? So now here we create an index, right? So this is basically a list comprehension that start creating date time for every day, and from the beginning, from the minimum all the way to the maximum, which is the number of days, right? So this is going to be our index, right? Let me just go ahead and print this out so for us to see it for a second. So this is our index, right? So it starts from the beginning, and we've got a day for every day, so that's what we want, right? And all the way to the end. Now we create a placeholder, we create a new data frame by this index, right? And this will be empty, right, in the beginning. But by just using the function update, and making sure that the indexes are the same for the data that we want to use for updating this placeholder, we bring in everything data that we have, and everything else that we don't have will remain 0, right? So you can see now everything else that we had will be matched here, and now everything else that we didn't have, actually we have them very seamlessly, very easy. We know that they are 0 now, right? So we can go ahead and plot this, and this plot is not biased now, right? So we've got those zeros added here, and now we can rely on this one. And you saw how easy it was to be able to do this using the DateTime data type. Alright, in this video we'll look at 2 examples to see the advantages of being able to work with the data type DateTime. Alright, until the next video.